The laughter came first. Not the warm kind, not the kind that fills a room. This laughter was sharp, measured, almost proud. It echoed just long enough to make people uncomfortable, and then suddenly stopped. That's when Muhammad Ali looked up. He hadn't been speaking. He hadn't even been part of the conversation. He was simply there, seated among men in tailored suits and polished shoes, in a room that smelled of expensive cologne and quiet confidence. Crystal glasses rested on white tablecloths. Conversations floated between money, influence, and education, spoken with the certainty of people who believed they had earned the right to be heard. Ali listened. Then one man leaned back in his chair. He smiled, not at the room, but at Ali, and with a casual tone, as if making an observation rather than an insult, he said it. Something about education. Something about real intelligence. Something that suggested Ali's greatness came from fists, not thought. For a split second, no one reacted. Not because they didn't hear him, but because everyone did. The words hung in the air, heavy and exposed. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. Another forced a chuckle, hoping to soften what had just been said. Muhammad Ali did nothing. No smile, no frown, no interruption. He didn't rush to defend himself, didn't correct the man, didn't remind anyone who he was. He simply leaned back slightly and waited. The silence stretched, long enough for the man to feel comfortable, long enough for him to believe his words had landed exactly where he wanted them to. Ali's eyes moved slowly across the table. Not angry, not embarrassed, focused. It was the kind of calm that unsettles people, the kind that doesn't beg for approval or rush to explain itself. Someone in the room glanced at Ali, expecting a joke. Another waited for a sharp comeback. None came. Instead, Ali folded his hands loosely in front of him, as if considering something far more important than the insult itself. And that's when the energy in the room began to change. The man's smile tightened. The confidence behind it started to crack. Because Ali wasn't silent out of weakness. He was silent because he was choosing his moment. The air felt heavier now. Conversations around the table died completely. Even the servers slowed their steps, sensing something they couldn't explain. Whatever Ali was about to say wouldn't be loud, wouldn't be rushed, and it wouldn't be forgettable. Because when a man who has nothing to prove decides to speak, the room has no choice but to listen. And in just a moment, Muhammad Ali would open his mouth and turn an insult into a lesson that no degree could teach. The room itself spoke before anyone did. Soft lighting reflected off polished wood and glass, casting a warm glow over a long table filled with men who looked very certain of who they were. Jackets were draped casually over chair backs. Watches caught the light when hands moved. Every detail suggested status, not the kind earned in a single lifetime, but inherited, reinforced, and rarely questioned. This was not a place for loud voices or sudden movements. This was a place where influence spoke quietly. Conversations flowed easily. Stocksmiths, universities, old connections. The names of schools were mentioned the way trophies are displayed, subtly but deliberately. Each reference earned nods of approval, small smiles, the unspoken acknowledgement of belonging. Muhammad Ali sat among them, listening. He wasn't positioned at the head of the table. He wasn't guiding the discussion. Yet somehow his presence shifted the space. Some people stole glances in his direction when they thought no one was looking. Not out of disrespect, but curiosity. Ali didn't fit neatly into the rhythm of the room. Not because he didn't belong, but because he didn't need to prove that he did. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was brief, thoughtful, almost disarming in its simplicity. But tonight, Ali seemed content to observe, to let the room reveal itself without interruption. The businessman, however, was in his element. He leaned forward when he spoke, elbows resting confidently on the table, his voice smooth and assured. He had the posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. When he mentioned his education, it wasn't boastful. It was matter of fact, as if success naturally followed people like him. Others followed his lead. They spoke of degrees and institutions, of credentials that opened doors and shaped futures. Each comment layered the atmosphere with a quiet hierarchy, an invisible ladder where some stood clearly above others. Ali remained silent, and that silence began to be interpreted. Not everyone saw it the same way. To some it felt respectful, to others reflective. But to one man at the table it looked like absence. The businessman glanced at Ali again, longer this time. He studied him with an expression that wasn't hostile, just curious, calculating, as if trying to place Ali into a category that made sense to him. Fighter, celebrity, entertainer, but intellectual. That label in his mind required credentials Ali didn't wear. The man smiled slightly as the conversation drifted back to education. He spoke about discipline, structure, proper learning. His words were polished, carefully chosen, The kind that sound reasonable until you realize what they exclude. Ali's name wasn't mentioned. It didn't need to be. The implication was clear enough. Around the table, reactions varied. Some nodded along, unaware of the undercurrent. Others felt it, that subtle shift where discussion turns into judgment. A few sensed that something was wrong, but no one interrupted. Ali didn't move. He rested back in his chair, hands relaxed, eyes attentive. The contrast grew sharper by the second. Here was a man who had stood in front of roaring crowds, faced fear and pressure on the world's biggest stages, sitting quietly while another man measured intelligence in classrooms and certificates. The room buzzed with confidence. But beneath it, something fragile had begun to form. Because power that needs to announce itself often misunderstands power that doesn't. And while the businessman continued speaking, comfortable in his assumptions, he failed to notice what others were beginning to feel. This room wasn't building toward agreement. It was building toward a moment, and Muhammad Ali was letting it come. The shift was subtle at first. The businessman's voice hadn't changed, but the rhythm of his words had. What began as general observations about education and discipline slowly narrowed, like a lens focusing on a single subject. His tone remained calm, reasonable, even, which made the message harder to challenge without seeming defensive. He spoke about how real success was built, how intelligence needed structure, how discipline came from classrooms, not chaos. A few people nodded along, half listening. Others stared down at their glasses, sensing where the conversation was drifting but unsure how to stop it. Then the man laughed softly. Not mocking, not openly, just enough to draw attention. He looked directly at Muhammad Ali. "Well," he said, as if offering a harmless thought, "not everyone had the opportunity for a proper education. Some people found other ways to succeed." The pause afterward was intentional. It allowed the words to settle, to be understood without being explained. No one missed the meaning. Ali didn't flinch. He had heard versions of this his entire life, whispered by reporters, disguised in polite interviews, sharpened by critics who believed fists and minds could not exist in the same man. He knew the pattern well. If he reacted too fast, he would seem insecure. If he joked, the insult would be dismissed as harmless. So he stayed still. The businessman continued, encouraged by the lack of resistance. "There's nothing wrong with that," he added, holding up a hand as if being generous. "Society needs entertainers, athletes, people with physical talents." A few forced smiles appeared around the table. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Another took a slow sip of water, eyes fixed on the glass. Ali felt the familiar pressure, not anger, but awareness. This wasn't just about him. It was about how intelligence was being defined, about who was allowed to be considered thoughtful and who was expected to remain silent. The man leaned back, satisfied. In his mind, the point had been made without cruelty. He believed he had spoken politely, reasonably, protected by the rules of civility that often shield the sharpest insults. Ali's silence worked against him. To the businessman, it looked like agreement, or worse, confusion. The room waited. Someone chuckled nervously, trying to break the tension. Another glanced at Ali, expecting him to laugh it off, to play the role assigned to him. He didn't. Ali lowered his gaze briefly, as if considering the table itself. His hands rested calmly in front of him. No clenched fists, no tightening jaw, but inside, something heavier stirred. He thought of the nights spent studying people instead of books, of learning timing, restraint, and humility, lessons not found on chalkboards, of realizing early that knowledge without empathy could easily turn into arrogance. Across the table, the businessman mistook Ali's reflection for weakness. He leaned forward again, pressing just a little further. "Of course," he said, smiling, "intelligence shows in how a man speaks, how he expresses ideas. Not everyone is trained for that." This time the air changed, not sharply but noticeably. Several people stopped pretending, faces grew serious. The insult had crossed a line from implication to exposure. What was once ambiguous now stood plainly in the open. Ali raised his eyes slowly. He met the man's gaze for the first time since the comment began. Not challenging, not hostile, just present. And that was when the businessman felt it, a flicker of uncertainty he couldn't quite explain. The kind that appears when you realize the person you underestimated has been watching you the entire time. Ali said nothing. The silence stretched again, but now it belonged to him. It pressed against the room, forcing everyone to sit with what had been said. The nervous smiles disappeared. No one reached for their glass. Even the servers hesitated near the edges of the space. Ali inhaled calmly. He wasn't preparing to defend himself. He was preparing to redefine the conversation. Because the greatest mistake the businessman made wasn't the insult itself. It was assuming Muhammad Ali needed to prove he was intelligent. And as Ali straightened slightly in his chair, the room sensed it. The struggle was over. The response was coming. Muhammad Ali shifted in his chair just slightly. It wasn't a dramatic movement, no sudden gestures, no sharp inhale meant to announce a response. But in a room trained to notice confidence, the change didn't go unseen. He lifted his head and looked directly at the businessman, not as an opponent, not as someone offended, but as a man about to speak with intention. When you talk about education, Ali began, his voice low and even, you talk about schools. The room leaned in almost without realizing it. Ali didn't rush. He let the words settle, then continued. I don't disagree with you, he said calmly. Schools matter. Books matter. Discipline matters. The businessman relaxed a fraction, sensing agreement. A few heads around the table nodded. It sounded like the start of a concession. But Ali wasn't finished. What I've learned, he continued, is that education isn't only about what you read, it's about what you understand. His eyes moved briefly around the table, not searching for approval, but acknowledging the room itself. You can memorize facts, Ali said, and still misunderstand people. A quiet shift passed through the group. Ali leaned forward slightly now, elbows resting loosely on the table. His posture remained relaxed, but the intent behind his words sharpened. I learned early on that not everyone gets the same classrooms, he said, but everyone gets life. No one interrupted. The businessman's smile faded, replaced by a polite stillness. He sat back, listening now rather than leading. Ali's voice never rose. I watched how men speak when they think they're superior, he continued. How they hide insults behind polite words. How they call it intelligence when it's really just comfort. That landed. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone exhaled quietly. The room had crossed from discussion into reflection. Ali paused, not for effect but for honesty. See, real learning, he said, teaches you humility. It reminds you how much you don't know. He looked directly at the businessman again. And if your education makes you feel bigger than another man, Ali added softly, then maybe it missed something. The words weren't sharp, they didn't need to be. The silence afterward felt different from before. This silence wasn't awkward, it was attentive. Ali straightened slightly, folding his hands together. I've met men with shelves full of books who couldn't read a room, he said. And I've met men who never finished school, but understood respect better than anyone I know. Across the table, one man nodded slowly. Another glanced down, thoughtful. Ali wasn't defending his past. He was expanding the definition of intelligence. I'm grateful for every lesson I've learned, Ali continued. From teachers, from opponents, from mistakes. His expression softened just a little. Because education without character, he said, is just information. The businessman shifted again, not angrily but uncomfortably. The power had moved and he felt it. Ali noticed but didn't press. Instead, he leaned back, giving the man space. I'm not offended, Ali said gently. I just believe wisdom shows itself in how we treat people, especially the ones we think we're better than. No accusation, no demand, just truth. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone cleared their throat, not to interrupt but to breathe. Ali's calm had done something unexpected. It hadn't embarrassed the businessman. It had exposed the idea behind the insult and left it nowhere to hide. And as Ali fell silent once more, the room understood something important. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a lesson. For several seconds, no one moved. The words Muhammad Ali had spoken didn't echo, they settled. Like weight. Like truth that couldn't be laughed away or politely ignored. The table that had once buzzed with easy confidence now felt carefully still, as if any sudden sound might break something fragile. A man near the end of the table nodded slowly, not toward Ali, but toward the idea he had just voiced. Another shifted in his chair, glancing briefly at the businessman before looking away again. No one rushed to fill the silence. That alone said everything. The businessman cleared his throat. He smiled, or tried to. It was the kind of smile people use when they realize the room is no longer on their side, but they're not ready to admit it. He adjusted his cuff, buying time, then leaned forward slightly. Well, he said, keeping his tone even, we all have our perspectives. Ali met his eyes calmly. Of course, Ali replied. The simplicity of the response only deepened the tension. The businessman continued, speaking more carefully now. Education shapes how people see the world. That's all I meant. Nothing personal. But the words didn't land the way he hoped. Because by now, everyone understood it had never been personal to begin with. It was about hierarchy. About who was allowed to speak with authority, and who was expected to stay in their lane. Ali waited. He didn't interrupt. Didn't challenge the explanation. He let the man hear himself. That was the turn. Because the more the businessman spoke, the more defensive he sounded, and the quieter the room became. Conversations that once overlapped now felt miles away. Even the soft clink of silverware had stopped. Ali leaned forward again slowly, Not aggressively, deliberately. "May I ask you something?" he said. The question was gentle, respectful, but it froze the room. The businessman hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice, then nodded. "Sure." Ali tilted his head slightly, considering his words. "Has your education?" Ali asked, "Ever taught you how to listen to someone you disagree with?" The question hung there. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't clever. It was direct. The businessman opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced briefly around the table, as if looking for support, but found only thoughtful faces and lowered eyes. Ali continued, his voice steady. "Because I've learned," he said, "that listening is harder than speaking, and it tells you more about a person than any title ever could." A quiet breath escaped someone at the table. Ali didn't stop. "Another question," he added softly. "Has it ever made you curious instead of certain?" That was it. The businessman leaned back slowly, the confidence he'd worn earlier now replaced with something closer to reflection or resignation. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The room felt different now. The tension hadn't disappeared, it had transformed. People weren't waiting for a fight anymore. They were waiting for meaning. Ali sensed it. He straightened slightly, his expression calm but intent. "I don't think education is the problem," he said. "I think forgetting why we learn is." Several people nodded openly now. One man smiled faintly, impressed not by the words alone, but by the restraint behind them. Ali had done what few people could. He had turned an insult into a mirror and invited the room to look. The businessman sat quietly, hands folded in front of him. He didn't interrupt again. No one did. Because the balance had shifted completely. The room no longer belonged to wealth or credentials. It belonged to the man who understood timing. And as Ali paused, letting the moment breathe, everyone sensed the same thing. This wasn't the end. The final words were coming. And when they did, they would break the tension wide open. The silence felt complete now. Not tense, not uncomfortable, complete. Muhammad Ali sat back slightly, giving the moment room to breathe. He wasn't rushing to fill the space. He understood something most people didn't. Silence, when earned, speaks louder than sound. Across from him, the businessman sat very still. Gone was the casual confidence. Gone were the smooth explanations. What remained was awareness. The kind that settles in when a person realizes they've been speaking from habit rather than understanding. Ali looked around the table one last time. Not to claim victory, but to include everyone, you know. Ali said, his voice calm and reflective. "I've been in rooms where people thought strength came from fists." A few people smiled faintly. "And I've been in rooms," he continued, "where people thought it came from words." The smiles faded into focus. "But real strength," Ali said, "comes from knowing when not to use either." The line landed softly, then deeper. Ali leaned forward just enough for emphasis. "I learned early that intelligence isn't about how much you can prove," he said. "It's about how much you're willing to understand." The businessman's eyes dropped to the table. Ali didn't look at him this time. He wasn't speaking to one man anymore. He was speaking to the room. "You can study your whole life," Ali continued, "and still miss the most important lesson." Several people nodded openly now. "That lesson?" Ali said. "It's respect." The word hung in the air, simple, undeniable. Ali paused, then added quietly, "Especially for people whose lives don't look like yours." For a moment nothing happened. Then someone clapped, just once. A soft sound, almost hesitant. Another joined in. Then another. Until the room filled with applause. Not loud, not wild, but sincere. The businessman looked up, startled by it. He didn't clap at first. He simply sat there, absorbing what was happening around him, realizing the applause wasn't against him but beyond him. Ali smiled gently, not in triumph, in understanding. When the applause faded, the businessman cleared his throat again, this time without performance. "You're right," he said quietly. It wasn't an apology. It didn't need to be. It was something rarer. Acknowledgement. Ali nodded once. That was enough. The tension that had gripped the room for so long finally released. Conversations resumed slowly, but they were different now. Quieter, thoughtful, less certain. One man leaned toward Ali and said softly, "That was impressive." Ali chuckled under his breath. "I just told the truth," he replied. The servers moved again. Glasses were lifted. The atmosphere warmed, but it never returned to what it had been before. Because something had changed. Not the man who had spoken. The idea behind his words. Ali sat back, relaxed, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. To him, moments like this weren't about winning arguments. They were about leaving rooms better than you found them. As the dinner continued, people approached him one by one. Some thanked him. Others simply nodded with new respect. The businessman remained quiet, not humiliated. Humbled, and that was the eruption. Not noise, not drama, but realization spreading across a room full of people who believed they were already educated and discovered they still had something to learn. The room had quieted again, not the tense silence of before. This was different, the calm after understanding. The kind that fills a space when people realize they've witnessed something rare, truth spoken clearly, without arrogance, without chaos. Muhammad Ali remained seated, calm as ever. He didn't need to dominate. The lesson had already been delivered. The applause had already shifted the energy. What mattered now was presence, and how it anchored those who had watched the exchange unfold. People around the table began to speak in hushed tones. Reflections, acknowledgments, reassessments. What had been a conversation about education and status had transformed into a quiet study of character, humility, and respect. Ali's gaze softened. He understood that his role in the room was never to belittle anyone. It was to protect the truth. To remind people that intelligence isn't just measured in degrees or diplomas. It's measured in understanding, empathy, and the ability to lift others, not tear them down. A young man across the table whispered something to his neighbor, clearly inspired. Someone else nodded, pensively sipping water. Even the businessman, the man whose words had started this chain, now sat quietly, contemplating the meaning rather than defending it. Ali finally spoke, his voice steady. Measured. Strength, he said, isn't about hurting others. It isn't about proving you're smarter or better. Real strength is about protecting those who can't protect themselves, and educating those who need to learn. The room absorbed it. A few faces brightened in recognition, a few heads lowered in thought. Every single person in that space had witnessed more than a lesson about respect. They had witnessed a demonstration of how calm authority and quiet confidence could move a room, without yelling, without aggression, without humiliation. Ali leaned back, giving space to the energy he had created, and the room, full of powerful men and confident voices, settled into an unexpected harmony. They had been tested in subtle ways, and the test was passed, not because they were corrected, but because they were reminded. Then Ali looked directly into the camera of a distant photographer, or maybe just across the room, and smiled softly. His message was clear: life is the greatest teacher, and respect is its most valuable lesson. It was time to leave a mark, not just in the moment, but in memory. This story isn't about winning debates or insulting arrogance. It's about demonstrating that intelligence without empathy is incomplete. That calm observation can be more powerful than loud arguments. That every person, whether with degrees, wealth, or fame, can learn from those who have mastered life in ways that books cannot teach. And the takeaway for us? It's simple: listen more than you speak. Respond with wisdom rather than emotion. Let your actions, not your ego, guide the room. Before we close, a small note for everyone watching. If Muhammad Ali's words moved you, hit like. If you want to see more stories like this, of legendary figures teaching lessons we can all apply, subscribe to the channel. Also, we'd love to hear from you. Which part of Ali's response struck you the most? Was it the calm, the question, or the final lesson on strength? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback helps us make better videos every time. Remember, the world remembers those who teach without anger, who inspire without boasting, and who protect without force. Muhammad Ali wasn't just a champion in the ring. He was a champion of character, humility, and respect. And while this dinner ended, the lesson didn't. It continues in every person willing to listen, reflect, and act. More stories like this are coming soon. Stories that reveal the wisdom behind the legend, the power behind the calm, and the truth behind the fight. So as you finish watching, think of one thing Ali taught here today: strength is quiet, respect is louder than words, and character is the greatest education of all.